I woke up to silence that didn't feel normal. Not the quiet kind you choose, but the kind that tells you something stopped working while you were asleep. The fridge was off. The small clock on the microwave was blank. My phone battery sat at 12%, and for a few seconds I just stared at it, trying to remember what bill I had promised myself I'd handle first. The message from the power company was short and polite in the way automated things are polite. Service disconnected. Balance overdue. Instructions attached. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt procedural, like something that happened to people who had already run out of small solutions. I got ready for work anyway. There's a strange dignity in routine when things start slipping. I ironed a shirt using heat that no longer existed, packed a lunch I knew would spoil by evening, and told myself I only needed time. Not money immediately. Just time. On the bus, I rehearsed sentences that sounded reasonable. I wasn't asking for help exactly. Flexibility. A shift change. Maybe permission to work remotely for a day so I could sort things out. HR was supposed to be the place where problems became manageable, where you explained context and someone translated it into policy. By the time I reached the building, the panic had settled into something quieter. Contained. I believed that if I explained my situation clearly, it would stay small. At 9:17, an email from HR appeared asking if I could stop by. The timing felt efficient. Too efficient. The meeting invite looked ordinary at first glance. A small calendar block, neutral subject line, the kind of administrative pause that filled most workdays. But when I opened it, I noticed two things that didn't fit the version of the conversation I thought I was about to have. The first was the second HR representative, someone senior, someone whose name only appeared in investigations or restructures. The second was the duration. 30 minutes. Long for flexibility. Short for anything complicated. I hadn't told anyone yet about the electricity. Not my manager, not my team. I'd planned to ease into the conversation, keep it practical. But the invite sat there like the conversation had already moved ahead of me. At my desk, small details started to feel louder than usual. My project dashboard took longer to load. A shared document I'd edited the night before showed restricted permissions. I refreshed, assuming it was a glitch. It didn't change. No notification. Just quiet removal. At 9:22, my phone buzzed. "Are you in a meeting today?" The message was from Daniel in operations, someone I spoke to maybe twice a week. I stared at the screen longer than the question required. I hadn't mentioned anything. There wasn't anything to mention yet. I typed back a neutral answer and watched the typing bubble appear, disappear, then appear again before nothing arrived. Across the room, my manager avoided eye contact in a way that looked practiced. When the calendar reminder popped up, it didn't feel like an interruption. It felt like arrival. I grabbed my notebook even though I didn't know what I would need to write down. The room was colder than the rest of the floor, the kind of temperature offices use to signal neutrality. Both HR representatives were already seated, folders placed carefully in front of them. That was the first moment something inside me tightened, not panic, just recognition. Preparedness has a shape. They asked how I was doing. I answered honestly enough. I explained the electricity situation in simple terms, the way you do when you're trying to sound responsible instead of overwhelmed. I said I only needed temporary flexibility. Time to stabilize things. I kept my voice steady because that felt important. They listened without interrupting. One of them nodded in small, professional intervals. When I finished, there was a pause that felt longer than reflection should take. Then the folder opened. The language shifted so quickly it took a second to register. Performance. Concerns. Documentation. Words that suggested a timeline I didn't remember living through. Papers slid across the table with the quiet friction of something final. I looked down and saw my name already printed in bold, paragraphs arranged like a story about me written from a distance. I asked when these concerns had been raised. The answer was careful, not inaccurate, but not complete. References to conversations that had never been framed as warnings. Feedback that had sounded collaborative now looked formal in writing. My eyes moved to the corner of the page where dates lived. Yesterday. I felt the timeline tilt. My situation had been spoken aloud for less than 5 minutes, and somehow the ending was already documented. One of them said the decision had been difficult. That was the moment I understood difficulty wasn't part of it. I remember nodding while they spoke, not because I agreed, but because my body needed something to do while my brain tried to reorganize the timeline. The conversation continued in that calm, practiced tone companies use when they want events to feel inevitable. They explained next steps, final pay, benefits timelines. Words designed to move you forward before you understand where you are. I asked a question that felt small compared to the paperwork in front of me. When had my access been restricted? The glance between them was brief, almost invisible. One of them said system changes sometimes happened automatically during transitions. The sentence was smooth enough that it might have worked if I hadn't opened my dashboard 20 minutes earlier and watched things disappear. I signed nothing. They didn't push. That was another detail that stayed with me. Urgency existed around my exit, not my agreement. When I walked back to my desk, the office looked unchanged in the way places do when something personal happens inside a shared space. Conversations continued. Screens glowed. My chair waited where I had left it that morning, a small pocket of normal that no longer belonged to me. I tried to log in once more. Access denied. No warning. No countdown. Just completion. My calendar refreshed and half the week vanished. Meetings removed like they had never existed. Threads archived. Ownership transferred. It wasn't the termination that unsettled me most. It was the sequencing. By the time I reached my desk after the meeting, parts of me had already been erased. My phone buzzed again. Different message this time. I heard, "I'm sorry. I hadn't told anyone yet." Security arrived with the kind of politeness that removes the possibility of refusal. Not aggressive, not apologetic. Procedural. One of them stood a step behind me while I packed, close enough to signal expectation, but far enough to preserve the illusion of choice. I moved slowly because speed would have made it real. A notebook, a mug, the charger I had been using to ration my phone battery. Ordinary objects that suddenly felt like evidence that I had existed here a few minutes earlier. People noticed without looking like they were noticing. Conversations lowered by half a degree. Chairs angled just enough to watch indirectly. The office had its own language for departures, and today I was fluent whether I wanted to be or not. My manager approached, but stopped short of conversation distance. His expression carried something that looked less like surprise and more like confirmation. He said the situation was unfortunate in a tone that suggested the sentence had been rehearsed privately before it reached me. As I zipped my bag, a colleague leaned closer than necessary under the pretense of adjusting a stack of papers. "This isn't the first time," she whispered. The sentence landed heavier than anything HR had said. Not dramatic. Not detailed. Just enough to shift the scale of what was happening. On the way out, my access badge was taken before we reached the door. Small efficiency. Final signal. Outside, the air felt louder than it should have. Traffic, footsteps, ordinary movement continuing at full volume while something inside me replayed the last 30 minutes in fragments. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. "We need to talk when you can." The apartment felt different when I unlocked the door, not just darker but paused, like the space had been waiting for confirmation of something. I set my bag down without turning on lights that wouldn't respond and sat at the table where I usually worked in the evenings. My phone battery hovered in single digits, forcing decisions about what deserved attention. The termination email had already arrived. The speed of it was precise in a way that suggested automation layered over preparation. Attached documents carried the same language from the meeting, expanded into paragraphs that sounded more certain on paper than they had in conversation. Performance concerns framed as patterns. Feedback reframed as warnings. Moments that had felt collaborative now positioned as evidence. I read slowly, not because the information was complicated, but because it was unfamiliar in its confidence. One incident described a meeting where expectations were clarified. I tried to remember it. I couldn't. The details were specific enough to feel real and distant enough to resist verification. I checked dates again. The cluster sat heavily in the final week, entries appearing closer together, urgency increasing in hindsight. Documentation has momentum once it starts, each line making the next one easier to write. My inbox showed threads I could no longer open, permissions revoked in ways that prevented context. The story existed without the conversation that created it. I noticed a phrase repeated across 2 documents: failure to respond to feedback. It stayed with me because I remembered responding. Carefully. Thoughtfully. The replies just weren't here anymore. My phone buzzed before the screen dimmed. Daniel again. They were building something, Laura. The message felt less like sympathy and more like clarification. I charged my phone using a portable battery meant for emergencies, watching the percentage climb slowly while my thoughts moved faster than I could organize them. When Daniel called, his voice carried the hesitation of someone stepping across an invisible line. He didn't ask how I was. He asked when things started feeling different. I told him about the past few weeks, small shifts that hadn't registered as signals at the time. Meetings rescheduled without explanation. Feedback that arrived in written form instead of casual conversation. Projects reassigned under the language of capacity balancing. Individually, they had sounded reasonable. Together, they formed a sequence. Daniel was quiet longer than conversation usually allows. Then he said leadership had been asking unusual questions. Not about outcomes. About documentation. Whether conversations were being recorded in systems. Whether expectations had been clearly stated. The questions hadn't been framed around improvement. They had been framed around traceability. I felt something settle into place that I hadn't wanted to name. Isolation doesn't announce itself. It accumulates until absence looks intentional. He mentioned that my largest project had been reassigned earlier that morning, before the HR meeting invite was sent. Not temporarily. Ownership transferred. Deadlines adjusted. The kind of administrative movement that happens when continuity has already been decided. I asked who initiated it. He didn't answer directly. He didn't need to. Before hanging up, he said something that stayed with me longer than the call itself. Just check your timeline. Not theirs. Yours. When the line went quiet, I realized I was trying to remember the exact moment the story about me stopped being collaborative and started being recorded. The unknown number called again just as the apartment slipped deeper into evening. I answered because uncertainty had started feeling heavier than whatever information might arrive. The voice on the other end belonged to someone from another department, a person I recognized more by presence than conversation. She didn't introduce herself fully, which made the call feel less official and more deliberate. She said she couldn't talk long. Not from work devices. Not during hours anyone could notice patterns. The caution carried its own message before any details were shared. She told me there had been discussions about consistency. Not performance exactly, but alignment. Whether feedback across teams reflected the same narrative. Whether documentation told a coherent story. The phrasing sounded less like management and more like editing. I asked when those conversations started. Weeks ago, she said. Maybe earlier. It depended on how closely you were paying attention. She mentioned HR attending meetings they normally wouldn't attend. Quiet observers. Notes taken without contribution. At the time, it had been explained as process improvement. After today, the explanation felt incomplete. I felt a strange separation listening to her, like she was describing weather patterns I had walked through without noticing the sky change. Before ending the call, she said something that shifted the scale again. You weren't the only file. The line disconnected before I could ask anything else. I sat there holding the phone, the silence afterward carrying more information than the conversation itself. This wasn't a moment. It was a method. Across the table, my termination documents remained open, paragraphs written as if the story had always moved in one direction. I kept rereading a message thread from a month earlier, a conversation with HR that had felt supportive at the time. They had encouraged me to document workload concerns, framing it as clarity rather than complaint. Write things down, they'd said. Specifics help us help you. I remembered hesitating before sending those notes, worried about sounding negative. I had softened language, added context, emphasized solutions. The goal had been balance, transparency without risk. Now the same sentences appeared in the termination documents, rearranged into something sharper. Where I had written capacity challenges, The report described difficulty managing priorities. Where I had asked for clearer timelines, it framed resistance to direction. The shift was subtle enough that each sentence remained technically accurate while meaning something different. Documentation doesn't need to be false to become unrecognizable. I opened the attachments again and compared phrasing line by line. Certain expressions matched my wording too precisely to be coincidence. My attempt at clarity had become structure. My effort to communicate had become chronology. I remembered the meeting where HR thanked me for being proactive. The reassurance had felt genuine, the kind that encourages you to keep speaking. Now I wondered whether encouragement had been part of collection. The realization wasn't dramatic. It arrived quietly, the way understanding often does when enough small details stop contradicting each other. My phone buzzed with a notification from cloud storage, a reminder about call logs nearing capacity. I opened the history and scrolled back to that morning. There it was. A call I barely remembered making, time-stamped hours before the HR meeting, sitting there like a marker placed without intention. I stared at the duration. Longer than I thought. I downloaded the call details because the instinct felt practical before it felt important. Time, duration, contact name, ordinary metadata that rarely carries emotional weight. But context changes the gravity of simple things. The call had lasted 23 minutes, which didn't match my memory of a quick conversation squeezed between morning tasks and quiet panic about the electricity. I tried to reconstruct it. I remembered pacing near the window at work, speaking in that careful half-voice people use when they don't want colleagues to hear personal details. I remembered explaining that things felt unstable, bills stacking, workload stretching, sleep shrinking. I didn't remember specifics, which suddenly felt significant. I opened the termination document again and looked at the timeline HR presented. The sequence implied deterioration that culminated in that morning's meeting, a narrative of gradual concern reaching necessary action. But the call existed outside that story, a version of events spoken before any formal conversation had taken place. Timestamps create order whether you intend them to or not. I noticed something else while comparing files. Several HR entries were saved within minutes of each other, clustered tightly as if written in a single sitting rather than over weeks. The language suggested progression. The metadata suggested assembly. I sat back, letting that distinction settle. Stories feel organic when you experience them forward. Documentation allows them to be written backward. My phone buzzed with a notification from the same contact as the morning call, a short message asking if everything was okay after our conversation. The wording stopped me. After our conversation. The phrasing assumed continuity, not conclusion. I typed a response, erased it, then opened the call recording settings. I didn't remember enabling them. The recording wasn't automatic, but the application I used for notes had captured fragments, not audio exactly, more like transcribed keywords generated in the background. Imperfect, incomplete, but anchored to time. I scrolled through the list slowly, each phrase appearing without tone yet carrying context I could suddenly recognize. Utilities. Exhaustion. Documentation. HR meeting later. I stopped at that last one. I hadn't known about the HR meeting when I made the call. The invite arrived afterward. The realization didn't feel dramatic. It felt structural, like discovering a support beam where you thought there was only drywall. The call had been practical. I had reached out because I needed advice about managing financial pressure without jeopardizing work. I had described workload concerns not as complaints, but as circumstances, the kind of information people share when they're trying to prevent problems rather than explain them. That sequence mattered. If my concerns existed before HR documented performance issues, the direction of the story changed. Not reversed. Just complicated in ways neat timelines resist. I read the transcript fragments again and noticed how specific some details were. Dates mentioned casually. Examples given without intention of record. Ordinary conversation creating reference points that didn't rely on memory. I realized the person I had called had asked careful questions. Clarifying ones. The kind that help you organize your thoughts, but also establish sequence. My phone buzzed. "I'm here if you need to talk again," the message read. "Also, keep any notes from today. Just in case." The phrase "just in case" carried more weight now. I looked back at the termination paperwork spread across the table and understood that my morning hadn't started with the meeting. It had started with a timestamp no one in that room had mentioned. I replayed the morning in smaller pieces, the way you do when the order of things starts to matter more than the things themselves. I remembered standing near the window, watching traffic move with that indifferent rhythm cities keep regardless of personal crises. The call had felt like a release valve, a place to speak without translating every sentence into something professional. I hadn't been strategic. That was the part that stayed with me. I wasn't building a case or preparing for conflict. I was explaining context to someone who understood how quickly circumstances could slide from manageable to fragile. The questions they asked had seemed ordinary. When did workload increase? Had expectations changed? Were conversations documented? At the time, the questions felt supportive. Now they felt anchoring. I opened the transcript fragments again and noticed how often time appeared indirectly. Last week. Earlier this month. Yesterday. Casual markers that created sequence without intention. The kind of structure memory struggles to maintain under stress, but documentation preserves automatically. My termination paperwork described momentum, concerns building toward intervention. The call suggested overlap instead, two narratives forming simultaneously without acknowledging each other. I checked the duration again, tracing where certain keywords appeared. The longer sections aligned with work discussion, not utilities. I had spent more time explaining professional pressure than financial strain. That ratio surprised me until I remembered how intertwined the two had felt. A notification appeared from Cloud Backup confirming the notes had synced. Saved, it said simply. I stared at that word longer than necessary. Saving implies future relevance, even when you don't know what that relevance will be. My phone buzzed again. Did HR mention timing? The message asked. I hadn't thought about that question yet. Timing became the only thing that felt measurable. I spread documents across the table and placed my phone beside them, comparing sequences the way you might align photographs to reconstruct an event you experienced too quickly. The HR narrative suggested escalation, leading to decision. My records showed conversation leading to awareness. Neither version was entirely incompatible. That was what made the tension harder to name. I noticed that several HR entries referenced responsiveness, moments where feedback was allegedly acknowledged without change. The phrasing implied opportunity followed by an action. But my messages from those same dates showed replies, clarifications, requests for examples. Evidence of engagement rather than absence. Documentation can describe the same interaction from opposite directions without technically contradicting itself. I returned to the call notes and saw something I had skimmed past earlier. A question about whether concerns had been raised formally. I had answered no, explaining that conversations felt collaborative, not corrective. That distinction now carried weight I hadn't assigned at the time. If HR later framed those conversations as formal warnings, the sequence shifted again. Awareness wasn't the endpoint. It was the missing middle. My phone buzzed with a new message from the person I'd called. I wrote down a summary after we spoke, they said. Mostly for my own reference. Nothing official, just notes. The sentence landed with quiet significance. Independent memory. Parallel timeline. Not proof of anything yet, but resistance to singular narrative. I looked at the termination paperwork, the confident paragraphs describing progression, and felt the first clear separation between what happened and what was written. Stories become harder to close when more than one version keeps its own time. The next call came from someone I hadn't expected, a former colleague who left months earlier under circumstances that, at the time, had sounded routine. Role changes. Better opportunity. The explanations companies use when departures need to feel voluntary. Her voice carried recognition more than surprise when I told her what happened. She didn't ask for details immediately. Instead, she asked what language HR used. Specific phrases. Whether documentation referenced patterns. Whether feedback had shifted from verbal to written near the end. The questions felt less like curiosity and more like comparison. When I confirmed, she exhaled in a way that suggested confirmation rather than sympathy. She described her final weeks, similar adjustments, similar emphasis on documentation, similar reframing of collaborative conversations into performance narratives. Nothing overtly false. Just selective continuity. Moments grouped to suggest direction rather than context. The most unsettling part wasn't the similarity. It was the consistency of tone. Professional. Measured. Difficult decision language that implied reluctance without demonstrating it. I asked whether she had noticed the shift while it was happening. Not clearly, she said. It only became visible looking backward, when timing compressed and gaps appeared where dialogue should have been. Before ending the call, she mentioned that HR had requested written reflections from her near the end, framed as self-assessment. Those reflections later appeared quoted in documentation describing awareness of concerns. Encouragement can double as collection depending on what happens next. After we hung up, I looked at my own notes again, the sentences I had written believing they would create clarity. Instead, they created continuity. My phone buzzed with a notification, another former colleague connecting on a platform we rarely used. The message preview read, "Did this happen to you too?" The documents blurred together after a while, not because they were complicated, but because their confidence created distance. Each version of my termination reason carried subtle variation, performance alignment in one, role restructuring in another, operational needs layered between them. None contradicted the others directly. They simply emphasized different conclusions. I placed the pages side by side and traced the shifts. Performance suggested personal trajectory. Restructuring implied external necessity. Operational language softened responsibility into inevitability. The narrative adjusted depending on audience without losing coherence. That flexibility unsettled me more than any single explanation. I checked the reposted job listing Daniel had mentioned. The description looked familiar at first glance, but closer reading revealed omissions. Responsibilities I had struggled to balance were removed, timelines extended, expectations redistributed across roles that hadn't existed before. The position wasn't identical. It was edited. Replacement doesn't always mean continuation. Sometimes it means correction without acknowledgement. I wondered when those adjustments were decided. Before the documentation intensified or alongside it. Cause and effect blurred once timelines overlapped. A message arrived from the colleague who had whispered earlier. She confirmed others had experienced similar transitions, though details varied. The common element wasn't performance. It was sequence, increased documentation, reduced dialogue, expedited conclusion. Process creates legitimacy even when outcomes remain ambiguous. I returned to my call notes and noticed something else. During that morning conversation, I had mentioned feeling like expectations kept shifting without clear reset. At the time, it felt like frustration. Now it read like description. My phone buzzed again. The person I called asked if any explanation had stayed consistent. I looked at the documents spread across the table and realized consistency wasn't the point. Completion was. I checked the job listing again later that night, partly to confirm it was real and partly because repetition sometimes reveals details first viewing misses. The posting timestamp sat only hours after my termination meeting. Not days. Not the gradual timeline companies describe when transitions are reactive. Hours suggested readiness. The description carried careful edits that shifted pressure points I had struggled with. Deadlines redistributed across multiple roles. Reporting lines clarified. Capacity language introduced where urgency had once lived. It read less like a replacement and more like revision, a version of the role that acknowledged friction without acknowledging the person who experienced it. I tried to imagine when those changes were written. Documentation doesn't appear spontaneously. It accumulates through drafts, approvals, quiet alignment. If the listing existed that quickly, conversations about structure had existed earlier too. The realization didn't feel personal at first. It felt procedural. Organizations adjust continuously. But the proximity between adjustment and termination complicated the explanation that my performance had driven urgency. Daniel sent a screenshot showing internal project ownership updated that morning, timestamps preceding the HR meeting. Tasks reassigned with neutral language, continuity planning, temporary coverage, phrases that maintain stability while signaling finality. I wondered whether continuity had been the goal all along. Not removal as punishment, but removal as simplification. My phone buzzed with a new notification, an email forwarded accidentally to my personal address before access disappeared. A fragment of internal conversation, brief enough to be dismissed and specific enough to linger. Timing matters here, it read. No context. No sender explanation. Just a sentence positioned between coordination and caution. I stared at it longer than necessary, recognizing how much meaning a single line can carry when sequence becomes the central question. The forwarded email fragment stayed open on my screen while I tried to decide whether its importance came from content or proximity. Timing matters here could describe almost anything: scheduling, logistics, routine coordination. But placed alongside everything else, the sentence felt less neutral. I checked the metadata on the message and saw it had been sent within an internal thread minutes before my meeting began. Not confirmation of anything, just adjacency. Still, adjacency shapes interpretation once trust in sequence weakens. Another message appeared from Daniel, shorter this time. Leadership meeting earlier. Your name mentioned. He didn't elaborate, which made the information feel heavier rather than incomplete. Detail invites debate. Absence invites inference. I returned to my own notes and noticed how often timing surfaced indirectly across conversations. Requests for written follow-up. Clarifications documented instead of discussed. Small shifts that prioritize record over resolution. Individually reasonable. Collectively directional. I opened the cloud storage where my morning call notes lived and reread the summary the other person had written. Their phrasing captured uncertainty without assigning blame, context without conclusion. A parallel description that didn't rely on organizational framing. Parallel timelines resist compression. A notification appeared from the same unknown number that had called earlier in the day. This time it wasn't a call, just a message. Check when your documentation started increasing, it said. Not conversations. Documentation. The distinction felt precise enough to matter. I scrolled back through emails, feedback tools, meeting summaries, tracing density rather than content. The pattern emerged gradually, entries sparse for months, then clustering tightly in recent weeks. Momentum that existed more on paper than in conversation. I sat there watching the pattern take shape and realized escalation can be experienced quietly while being recorded loudly. My phone buzzed again. You might want to save everything, the message read. Just in case timing becomes the story. It took time for the emotional part to catch up with the structural part. Until then, everything felt analytical: timelines, documents, phrasing. But sitting in the dim apartment with my phone battery draining again, the reality shifted from pattern to meaning. If the organization saw me as a risk to manage rather than a problem to solve, the sequence made more sense. Risk doesn't require wrongdoing. It requires unpredictability. I replayed recent conversations in that light. Moments where I asked for clearer priorities. Where I flagged workload strain without framing it as complaint. Where I documented context because I thought transparency created safety. None of those actions were confrontational, but they created visibility. Visibility changes how organizations calculate certainty. The call I made that morning felt different now too. Not strategic, but directional. I had described circumstances out loud to someone outside the immediate system. Not escalation in the formal sense, just acknowledgement that the situation extended beyond internal dialogue. If the organization sensed that shift, even indirectly, termination could function less as reaction and more as containment. The idea unsettled me because it didn't require intent. Processes designed to reduce ambiguity can produce similar outcomes without coordinated malice. Documentation increases. Dialogue narrows. Decisions accelerate. My phone buzzed with a message from the person I'd called. I saved the notes because you sounded overwhelmed, they wrote. Not as evidence. Just memory. The distinction mattered. Memory preserves nuance that documentation often compresses. I looked at the termination paperwork again and noticed how little uncertainty it allowed. Sentences moved forward confidently, gaps smoothed into continuity. The story didn't describe doubt because doubt complicates closure. Another message arrived. "Did anything change at work after we spoke?" they asked. I stared at the question and realized something had. The meeting invite arrived. I requested my personnel file the next morning through the formal channel outlined in the termination email. The act felt procedural rather than confrontational, an administrative step framed as entitlement rather than challenge. Still, the confirmation reply arrived faster than expected, which had started to feel like its own category of information. The file appeared as a compressed archive, orderly in a way that suggested completion. I opened it slowly, aware that organization can create coherence regardless of content. Documents layered chronologically, feedback entries interspersed with summaries, acknowledgments captured through digital signatures that reflected receipt rather than agreement. What stood out wasn't individual entries, but density. Months of minimal notation followed by a sudden increase, observations recorded with specificity that exceeded previous patterns. Language consistent across different authors, phrasing aligning more closely than independent reflection usually produces. Consistency can signal collaboration or standardization. The difference isn't always visible from the outside. I compared timestamps to my own calendar and noticed overlaps where documentation appeared during meetings that had focused on entirely different topics. Notes written while conversations unfolded without reference to the concerns later described. Parallel narratives forming in real time. One entry attributed to HR summarized a discussion I remembered as exploratory, reframing it as clarification of expectations. The shift was subtle but directional, possibility translated into requirement. I paused at a section labeled Timeline Overview. The summary compressed weeks into sequence, each entry reinforcing progression toward intervention. Efficient. Convincing. Difficult to dispute without alternative chronology. My phone buzzed with a message from the person I'd called. "If you need, I can send you the notes I wrote after our conversation," they said. Nothing formal. Just timestamps and context. I looked at the organized file on my screen and understood that parallel records don't cancel each other out. They complicate certainty. I opened the timeline overview again and read it as if it described someone else. Distance made the structure clearer. Each entry followed the logic of escalation, observation, feedback, continued concern, decision. The sequence felt persuasive because it was uninterrupted. No pauses, no competing interpretation, no indication that conversations might have carried multiple meanings at the time. I began cross-referencing entries with my own notes, not searching for contradiction but for alignment. Several HR summaries referenced meetings where expectations were reinforced. My calendar showed those meetings focused on project planning, capacity distribution, routine check-ins. The content overlapped without matching emphasis. It wasn't fabrication. It was framing. I noticed something else in the metadata. Multiple entries shared nearly identical creation times, clustered within narrow windows that suggested retrospective documentation rather than ongoing record. The language still implied progression, but the timestamps suggested assembly. Narrative written in batches instead of moments. That distinction didn't invalidate the content. It altered the rhythm. I placed my phone beside the documents and opened the notes from the morning call the other person had sent. Their record didn't attempt structure. It captured uncertainty, questions, tone. Fragments that preserved ambiguity rather than resolving it. The contrast between the two timelines felt less like conflict and more like different purposes. One sought closure. The other preserved context. My phone buzzed with a notification from the HR portal confirming my file request had been logged as complete. Administrative language signaling finality again. I reread a line from the overview describing my situation as culmination. Culmination implies inevitability. But inevitability depends on where you begin counting. I stepped outside that afternoon because the apartment's quiet had started to feel like repetition rather than reflection. Walking without destination created space for the question that had been forming beneath everything else, whether my crisis triggered the decision or simply provided timing. The distinction mattered more than blame. I replayed the sequence, documentation density increasing, projects reassigned, leadership conversations happening beyond my view. My electricity situation hadn't initiated those changes. It intersected with them. A visible moment that aligned with an existing trajectory. Alignment explains speed. The call I made that morning now felt less incidental. Not because it caused anything, but because it established context before interpretation solidified elsewhere. A record of uncertainty existing alongside a record of certainty. Parallel narratives moving toward the same endpoint without acknowledging each other. My phone buzzed with a reply from the person I'd called after I sent a brief update about the termination. "That's fast," they wrote. Did they mention prior concerns? The phrasing assumed sequence mattered, not justification. I explained the documentation, the timeline overview, the way language suggested gradual progression. Their response arrived after a pause longer than usual. "When we spoke, you didn't describe escalation," they said. "You described confusion." The sentence stayed with me as I walked. Confusion rarely appears in formal records because it resists direction. It complicates conclusions. But lived experience often contains more uncertainty than documentation allows. I realized then that my termination didn't contradict the call. It reframed it. The conversation captured a moment before narrative hardened. My phone buzzed again. "Keep your own timeline," they wrote. Even if no one asks for it. I understood that maintaining sequence wasn't about proving anything yet. It was about resisting compression. I called them that evening, not because I needed advice, but because silence had started to feel like omission. Explaining what happened out loud forced sequence in a way documents couldn't. I described the meeting, the paperwork, the speed. The way language moved forward without acknowledging uncertainty. They listened without interrupting, the same way they had that morning, but the quality of the silence felt different now, less supportive, more attentive. When I finished, they asked a question that shifted the frame again. "Did anything they said contradict what you described earlier?" I paused because contradiction wasn't the right word. The organization's version didn't deny my experience, it rearranged emphasis. My confusion became resistance. My requests became evidence. The same events moving under different interpretation. They explained that after our call, they had written notes partly to help me think through next steps, partly because conversations about work stress often blurred over time. Not official. Not shared. Just reference anchored to time. The existence of that reference felt heavier now than when they first mentioned it. Independent memory doesn't resolve disagreement, but it resists singular narrative. They asked if the termination referenced my crisis directly. I told them no. The documents stayed professional, contained within performance language. The timing existed without explanation. Another pause. Then they said something carefully. "That means the record of your situation exists before the decision without being shaped by it." I understood the implication immediately. Not proof of intent, not contradiction. Sequence preserved outside organizational framing. My phone buzzed while we were still on the call, a message from Daniel. "People are nervous," it read. Conversations shifting. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I felt the direction changing. The notes they sent arrived the next morning as a simple document, timestamps, fragments, questions captured without conclusion. Reading it felt like stepping back into a version of the day that hadn't been resolved yet. My situation described in language that allowed uncertainty to remain visible. Context without trajectory. I placed their notes beside the timeline overview from my personnel file and noticed how differently each handled the same concept, sequence. The organization's version moved steadily toward intervention. The call notes moved laterally, documenting variables without assigning direction. Neither inaccurate. Both incomplete alone. What shifted for me wasn't content but perspective. The call created a reference point that existed before interpretation consolidated. A moment where my circumstances were articulated without anticipation of termination. That separation mattered because it preserved ambiguity that later documentation resolved. Daniel called mid-morning, his voice lower than usual. He said leadership had asked questions about when certain concerns were first raised externally, phrased carefully but carrying implication. Not accusation. Curiosity about sequence. About visibility beyond internal systems. I didn't tell him about the notes. Not out of secrecy, out of recognition that parallel records change conversations simply by existing. I reread a line from the call summary where I had described feeling like expectations were shifting faster than explanations. At the time, it sounded like stress. Now it sounded like observation captured before conclusion. My phone buzzed again. A different colleague this time, brief and cautious. "They're reviewing timelines," the message said. I sat there with both documents open, understanding that review doesn't guarantee outcome. It introduces friction. It complicates certainty. The termination still stood. Nothing about my job changed. But the story about how it happened no longer belonged entirely to one version of time. The message from inside the company arrived late in the afternoon, written with the careful neutrality people use when they don't know how permanent anything is. It didn't ask questions directly. It referenced process, clarification, whether certain dates aligned with conversations that had occurred outside formal channels. The language avoided implication while circling sequence. I read it twice before responding with something equally neutral. Facts without interpretation. My termination date. The timing of the HR meeting. Nothing about the call notes. Nothing about the parallel record that now existed quietly beyond their documentation. Not concealment, boundary. Understanding that information changes weight depending on when it enters a narrative. Later, Daniel told me leadership seemed less certain about phrasing than before. Not reversal. Adjustment. Conversations that once sounded conclusive now included qualifiers. Timing under review. Context being revisited. Small linguistic shifts that suggested friction rather than transformation. I realized then that exposure doesn't always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it appears as hesitation, confidence interrupted by the possibility of alternative sequence. Documentation designed to close a story now encountering another version that preserved uncertainty. My role hadn't changed. The job listing remained active. Processes continued. Yet, something intangible had shifted from inevitability to consideration. I reread the call notes again, noticing how ordinary they looked. No accusation. No strategy. Just a record of confusion existing before conclusion. The power wasn't in what they proved. It was in what they prevented compression into a single, uninterrupted explanation. That night, I turned off my phone earlier than usual, not from avoidance, but because the urgency had changed shape. Nothing needed immediate response anymore. The meeting ended my employment. It didn't finalize sequence. Weeks passed without resolution in the way stories often promise. The company moved forward publicly, the role filled by someone inheriting a version of responsibilities already adjusted. Internally, Daniel described conversations that sounded less certain than before, references to process refinement, documentation review, language that acknowledged complexity without assigning fault. Subtle recalibration rather than reversal. I stopped rereading the termination paperwork daily. Not because it lost relevance, but because its authority felt less absolute once another timeline existed alongside it. The call notes remained saved in a folder I rarely opened, their significance quieter now, less like leverage and more like preservation. Memory anchored to time resists editing. Occasionally, messages arrived from former colleagues describing small changes, increased emphasis on real-time feedback, meetings including clarification where summaries once replaced dialogue. Nothing dramatic. Adjustments that suggested awareness without admitting cause. Organizations rarely narrate learning as consequence. I understood then that my story wouldn't end with vindication or confrontation. The outcome stayed practical. I lost the job. Bills still required attention. Life reorganized around different constraints. But sequence had shifted in a way that mattered privately even if it remained invisible publicly. The meeting HR believed concluded the situation, instead fixed a timestamp that couldn't be rewritten backward. My circumstances, spoken before interpretation solidified, continued to exist independently of the narrative that followed. Not proof of wrongdoing. Proof of timing. Quiet victories rarely look like resolution. They look like ambiguity preserved where certainty was expected. I don't know how those conversations inside the company ultimately settled. I know hesitation entered them. I know sequence stopped belonging entirely to documentation. They ended my role in 10 minutes. They didn't control when my story began.